BookTube, welcome back to my channel. Today we're here to talk about our October reads. In October, we read 10 books. We had hoped it would have been more. We hoped that it would have been some different books because I had a whole Victober plan. For Victober, I only read one thing, and that was a play by Oscar Wilde, sadly. But I did read some really wonderful books in October, so we're not going to focus on the failures. We're going to talk about the successes. So, 10 books in October, and of those 10, there were some really wonderful things. One of the biggest accomplishments of October is that I finally finished the Pulpit, which I posted about on Instagram so many times. Didi for Brown Girl Reading said, haven't you been reading that book for like 3 months? Yeah, it took us about 3 months to read this mammoth of a book. I wanted to say something else. It's by Doris, Kearns, Goodwin, entitled The Pulpit, and it looks at the lives and the presidential and political careers of two men, Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. And the subtitle is Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism, because it talks about the influence that journalism and journalists had on the careers of these two presidents, how Theodore Roosevelt used journalism to his advantage and kind of chucked them to the side when it was no longer a win for him. Also talks in a big way about the impact that investigative journalists and journalism at that time had on policy making, because talking about the late 1800s, early 1900s, and this was at a time when newspapers and magazines were media, and we see the influence that people who had the ability and the capacity to do research and write their opinions, how they shaped the perspectives of people across the country and spread awareness of some of the economic issues that were happening in the country that maybe people in other parts of the United States wouldn't have known about otherwise. And so because this book is really big, Doris Kearns Goodwin had an opportunity to do a deep dive or deep dives and give us very introspective looks at the lives of these two men, but also of the community around them, talking about the people who helped them and how they responded. So I thought it was a really interesting read. I know we say that about everything, that things are interesting, but this was really interesting. You know, a book has to really be interesting to hold you enthralled for over 700 pages. And I thought that this was a really, really stellar accomplishment for Doris Kearns Goodwin. She is a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and it's not hard to see why. So I read this one in my buddy reading group. Patrice Jones, who doesn't have her own BookTube channel, but she comments here on BookTube a lot, and Doris from All the Books, and Heidi from My Reading Life, and those three ladies and myself, we read a lot together. And I think this is the kind of book that benefits from reading with a group, reading with a community, and being able to share how this book impacts you. The books that I read, in the order of how I read them, first was The Outlook for Earthlings by Joan. I got this one from the publishers to review, and I really enjoyed this one. It is a very tender story about friendship and how friendship can endure even as people change, how much of their personality still remains the same. And this followed two girls that we meet as children, and we see the parallels in their lives. Both of their fathers work as university professors, but they're very different in their stance, very different in how they relate to their families. But we see these two girls with similar, not quite backgrounds, but similar framework of their lives. We see how those frames, how those bars either channel things in, rein things in, or make people feel like rebelling. And so we see very different paths that these two women take as they go forth in their lives, and the hopes and dreams that they have, and you know, how they are rewarded, how they're disappointed, and the choices that they make as they go forward, and then later when they come back and revisit their friendship after some years of being separated, how how their lives have turned. I mean, I thought it was a really interesting look, the way the author looked at these two people and gave us the evolution of relationships in marriages, but also in friendships. And I thought it was really well done. So this is a small publisher, so this is not a book that's going to get a lot of press. So I thought that I would use my opportunity, use my platform here to mention it. The Outlook for Earthlings by Joan. Check this one out if you can. If you're looking for an independent publisher or independently published book to support, this is a really good one. I'm wearing my glasses, so I can't read very well. This is Joan right there. So that was my second book in October. My third book that I read was also from the publishers, this time from Penguin Random House. And this is The Travelers by Regina Porter, who is a woman of African descent, African-American woman. This one was one of those sweeping multi-generational family stories where we meet a young woman in the early 1900s and we see a violent episode happen in her life and how it changes what she maybe wanted to do with her life, and eventually how those choices ripple down to her children and her children's children. So we meet this young woman, and she is having a same gender relationship with another woman, and they've been living in her parents' house as friends, roommates. But unbeknownst to everyone else, they're secretly having this relationship. But she meets this man and they start dating. And they go on this date, and there is a violent episode with police. And they go back, and you almost want to cry for her response and also for the young man that she's on the date with, his response to this incident. But then she goes and she makes this decision to move away, leave the South, and go do something else with her life because she's so changed by this violent episode. And we see the changes, how they affect her, how they affect this man, and also the woman that she was in that relationship with. And so I thought that this was a really profound look at how little things blossom into big events that change not just one person but change a generation. And I thought that the writing in this one just struck so many chords in my heart that, I haven't seen a lot of people talk about this book, but I'm hoping that it gets a little bit more attention, a lot more attention. There were places in this book where it feels like the story is going in so many different places because we're following so many different characters, but they're all related. And I love seeing that. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like the Alex Haley Roots story. It's like, Jesse's homegoing. It's that kind of, I know your mom, I know your mom's mom, and you're my cousin, and we didn't know each other from before, but I like that. So I thought that was really well intentioned and really well executed, this idea of connectivity. Also, because we are meeting generations from two families, and I mentioned that there are two families. There's one black family and one white family, and we're seeing how they come together and go back apart and come together and go back away from each other. And I thought it was just so well done. So yeah, The Travelers by Regina Porter, highly recommending that you check this one out. It is a new release as well. And so this was my first book that I finished in October. Second book I finished was The Travelers. The third book was The Bully Pulpit, which I already mentioned. And my fourth book that I finished in October was nonfiction, Let the World See You by Sam Acho. And the subtitle of this one is How to Be Real in a World Full of Fakes. The author is an NFL player. He is also a writer, public speaker, and humanitarian. His family is from Nigeria, and he talks about growing up and feeling a little isolated because he didn't necessarily fit in with all the people around him. His father was a preacher, and he tells briefly his father's story of preaching in Nigeria and someone bringing him to the United States to work as a missionary. But the life of the immigrant is not easy. I can tell you that from my own experience, and I'll also tell you that the life of the child of the immigrant is not always easy, because the child of the immigrant, even though they are American, a lot of people don't see them necessarily like that. And so this young man talks about feeling isolated in lots of places in his life, that even when he was at church, the kids would make fun of him because he tried so hard to fit in, and and you're trying to learn to be cool on your own, you probably don't do too good of a job doing that. And so the kids would make fun of his attempts to wear name brand clothes and so on, and how he hid in a bathroom for hours to avoid the people around him. And it took him a while to realize that his uniqueness was not something that he should hide, it's something that he should celebrate. And so after having learned that lesson, he writes about allowing yourself, allowing your true self to shine through, letting people see who you really are, not trying to pretend to be someone else, because who you are, the unique gift that is you, is exactly what other people need, sometimes as inspiration, sometimes just to see that they're not the only weirdo because there's someone else like them. And I thought that the lessons in this book were just so heartfelt. His writing, I thought, was just so on point. He talks about places in his life where he was tempted to dim his light or to hide behind stereotypes, to hide behind what other people believed him to be. And so he talks about being an athlete and people expecting him to be this grim, gruff, maybe not grim, but this gruff, brusque personality because, defensive player. I think he's a defensive player in the NFL. I can't remember, no, it's been a while. But people expecting him to be, kind of off-putting and casual and whatever. And when they meet him and he allows his true personality to shine, and they're just, they're just like kind of blown away by how nice and good of a person he could be. And he talks about how that is the person that people need him to be around them. And oh, I love this book. I read this book in an afternoon because it's the kind of story that just pushes you to want to read more. Everything in this guy's life is not perfect. He talks about challenges, difficulties, and yet overcoming them. So he frames his story with his relationship with God, his relationship with the Word of God, and so he shares Bible texts in here. But it's not over the top. It's not the kind of sharing that is off-putting, even if you are not a believer. So I highly recommend this one as well. So that's the fourth book that I read, and so far I've loved all of them. Was there anything that I read that I didn't love? Nope. Carrie by Toni Jensen, I also want to push on you. This was another gift from the publisher Penguin Random House, and this one is a collection of essays written by a woman who is of Native American descent. She is Métis, and in here she shares her perspective on Native American culture and the stereotypes that we have of Native American people and her own experience living this life. So in this book she talks about word etymology, she talks about origins, is really how she's tracing her life. She's talking about the origins of things. Right, take your shoes off. And so she talks about words that might mean one thing to you, but she talks about its alternate meanings and just kind of how we frame a word and how that colors our understanding of the word and how we carry that word with us. I was kind of catapulted by some of the statements that she made about violence that had been visited upon her and how she carries those scars, some external, some internal. She talks about the people that have shared her life at different points and the marks that they have made on her. And oh man, there were just some stories in here that she made you wait for. Like, she tells you early on that there was violence in her home and that her father did something to her, and it's not until, man, like 20 pages to the end where she really shares with you the story, the full story. But it's a story worth waiting for, because I feel like maybe if she had shared that story earlier on, that I might not have been able to read any further, just because it's so heart-wrenching. Oh, but Carrie by Toni Jensen, I promise I'm gonna reread this one and maybe do a more coherent review, other than to say right now, please read this book. It's a new release and I want other people to read it and talk about it, talk about indigenous culture and the scant regard we seem to have for Native Americans. Even in 2020, when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and people are responding, no, it's not just Black lives that matter, all lives matter. Okay, well, prove it. Prove that Native lives matter as well. You know, I'm not above having the discussion about all lives matter, but yeah, show me that all lives matter by showing that all lives, all groups matter to you as well. That was carried by Toni Jensen. And this video is super long, but you'll bear with me because I had a really great reading month. The next book that I read was a book that I read in electronic format from my library. It was The Collective Schizophrenias by Esme Weijun Wang. And this is a woman of Asian heritage living in the United States and writing about her experience dealing with schizophrenia, having mental illness from a young age, and her experience living with it, trying to show that she's normal, and you know, being rejected from relationships, being rejected from schools, just because people and institutions don't necessarily know how to deal with mental illness and want to distance themselves from it as much as possible. In writing about mental illness as an abstract, writing about it in a more academic way, I felt like the book was not quite as successful. I preferred to read about the things that she was writing about from her own experience as a patient, as a person who has experienced these episodes. And so I wanted more of that from the book. It is a pretty short book. I don't remember how many pages. Like I said, I read it in an electronic format. But I wanted more of her story. I wanted more of why she did the things that she did. And she gave us a lot of that. I wanted more. And I think that that's the mark of a really good book, that you're left wanting more of that story. So The Collective Schizophrenias by Esme Weijun was that title, and I read that one because of an online book club that I belong to. And yeah, I'm happy to participate in all these group reads because, you know, they make me read books that I wouldn't necessarily have chosen myself. The next book that I read was Book of Echoes by Rosanna Amaka, which I also read because of a group. This time, Didi from Brown Girl Reading and Read So Lit invited us to read a book to celebrate Black History Month in the United Kingdom in October, and the choice was the Book of Echoes by Rosanna Amaka because this is a woman from the African diaspora who lives in England. And it turns out, I didn't know this at the time, but Rosanna Amaka has Jamaican roots as well. Her parents are Jamaican and Nigerian, and so she writes from that dual perspective in this book. We're reading about a woman who is stolen into slavery, and she leaves a child behind in Africa, and she has a child in this part of the world. And she escapes slavery, kind of, and goes to England, and there she loses her second child before she dies. And so we're following her descendants in current time, but we also see that slave woman. We see her spirits kind of following the descendants as well, and she's acting as a narrator and showing us how her children's children are faring in this time. I thought it was such an interesting and engaging book. Man, she covered some really interesting parallels, but also some very interesting differences as she talks about, you know, the continuity and the divergence of the experience of people of the diaspora, kind of no matter where they go, the challenges that they have, the discrimination that they face, where people expect them to act a certain way just because, you know, they're African or they're from their African descendants. And so I thought that it was really well done, really, really well done. If you are not following Didi from Burn Girl Reading, I don't know why you wouldn't be, but you should go check her out. Check out her BookTube channel. She had a live discussion on her channel last week where the author, Rosanna Amaka, came on and they discussed the book, and I thought it was so fantastic. So check that out. And that was, how many books now have we talked about? 2, 4, 6, 7. So we have 3 more, right? 3 more. Next is One of the Good Ones by Maika and Maritza Moulite. They are Haitian sisters. This is young adult fiction, or it's marketed as young adult fiction, but I think it's so much more. This is an art that I got from Inkyard Press, which is an imprint of HarperCollins, and I thought that this was such a great read. The story is following three sisters. The middle sister is an activist who gets killed protesting in the Black Lives Matter movement, and we're seeing how her family is impacted by her death. One thing about this book that is really well done is how they incorporated the Negro Motorist Green Book. That was a book that was published in the middle of the 1900s to help African American drivers find places that they could visit while they were making road trips, places that they could get food or gas or find accommodations during a period of extreme discrimination when you never knew who you were going to encounter when you were driving. It helped people find places of safety. And so in this book, after the young activist is killed and her sisters try to go on this road trip to carry on their sister's legacy, they also use the Green Book. But we also, like I said, go back in the past and see how people in the past used it as a matter of life and death. I don't know how to talk about these books and really discuss them and give them the weight that they deserve and still be concise. So I'm going to have to find another way to talk about these books at a different point. For now, just add this one to your TBR. One of the good ones by Maika and Maritza, Moulite. And this one goes on sale on January 5th, 2021. So I still have some time to hype it up. Second to last book is Oscar Wilde's play An Ideal Husband, which I don't have a lot to say about it because Oscar Wilde, a lot of people have read him. This play was published in the late 1800s. An Ideal Husband is about British aristocrat society and Oscar Wilde poking fun at these people who say that they're really high society people but are very hypocritical and they have skeletons in their past just like everyone else. And so we meet this society group at a dinner party and we see how they throw shade at each other, how they make these little statements to show their true feelings about each other and about the society and about themselves. And then we have this woman who comes into the dinner party. I think she's been invited by someone, but they don't really know her true identity. And she comes and she exposes this man for who he is, even though he's been passing himself off as this wonderful person. She comes to reveal that she knows something about something that he did in the past, and now she's trying to blackmail him into doing something very similar, but now for her benefit. And Oscar Wilde's plays are humorous just because, you know, like I said, he shows us who we are when we're trying to be something else, and shows us who other people are when they're also trying to be other things. And so I thought it was funny. It was my only read for Victober, and so I'm giving it the highest praise just because it was my only thing from the Victorian era that I read in October. It's a short play, so read it when you have a chance if you haven't already. I'm going to try to read something by Oscar Wilde every year until I go through everything that he has written. The last book that I finished in October was this book that is not yet released. It's coming out on November 17th, being published by Akashic Books, and I'm going to use the rest of my time here on this video to hype up this book. It is A Million Aunties by Alecia McKenzie. She's a Jamaican. She now lives in France, and I love this book. I felt like it was the authentic Jamaican experience. We're reading about a man who his wife, were they married? Yes, they were married. His wife was brutally killed, and he also lost his mother sometime before. And reeling from this trauma, he decides to go to Jamaica on a visit because his mother is Jamaican, even though he grew up in the United States. He decides to go to Jamaica to learn how to paint flowers. He's an artist, but the thing that he has struggled with is capturing light. And so he goes to Jamaica, and he is adopted as an adult, adopted by this woman who he goes to stay with on the recommendation of his friend and agent. And in going there, he reconnects with family members that he hadn't seen for decades. And he learns something about himself, about his mother, about Jamaican culture. and it helps him to start being able to see the flowers. But in the meantime, he also is able to shed light on other people who are experiencing trauma or have experienced trauma and are not sure how to deal with things. Can you hear me over her chatter? I thought that Alecia McKenzie was just so clever in how she gave us little snippets of introductions to all these characters who I feel like this book could birth an entire series of novels where we follow each one of those characters for themselves. Oh man, I love this book. You're going to hear me talk a little bit or a lot more about it in the upcoming days and weeks. And so this is a really long video where I talked about 10 books that I read in October. And I kind of want you guys to read all of them. So this was my little hype for all 10 books that I read in October, and me encouraging you to check out one or all 10 of them at your leisure and see which ones you might love as well. Some Caribbean fiction for you, Caribbean fiction, Caribbean authors, a little non-fiction, a little essay, a little memoir, a little feel-good, a little history, a little racial injustice, but also pride and hope and forgiveness and learning how to live with each other, and a little friendship, and a little ebook that I don't have here, and a little baby. So thank you so much for enjoying this video. I don't know what you heard and how much of what I said you heard, because again, a lot of her talking over me, because she has a lot to talk about. We brought your books to the table, but you didn't get to hold them. Oops, sorry. We brought your books to the table, but we didn't get to hold them up. The books that you've been reading recently. The Foot Book by Dr. Seuss, and the Apples, 10 Apples Up on Top, also by Dr. Seuss, and Big Dog, Little Dog by P.D. Eastman, and of course, her favorite, Good Night, Curious George by Margaret and H.A. Ray, which is a touch and feel book, which she has to touch the pictures and the textures every night before she goes to bed. So yeah, that's both of our October wrap-ups. Feel successful? Wonderful. Thank you so much for watching this video. Give me a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe if you want to see more. Lots more books to talk about. But thank you again so much for watching. Chat in the comments. Would love to hear from you if you've read any of these, if you have thoughts that you want to share with me. And until next time, happy reading. Bye.